Greetings and welcome. I am Jack and this is my third Pathfinder 2nd edition build guide. These videos are beginners builds, not in the sense that they are builds for beginners, but that they are builds made by a beginner who is trying to learn the system by theory crafting, which may be the hardest way, but hopefully it's entertaining enough. Today we are dealing with the Champion, which is a class that does not technically exist in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but it's a Paladin equivalent. So what we are going to do is, as usual, I'm going to present an overview of the class, then I'm going to try and give a rationale behind the build I'm trying to make, then I'm going to present the actual build, and in conclusion, we will see a damage projection. No spellcasting here, because the Paladin, the Champion, that is, does not cast spells. Before we begin, thanks are in order to the Definitive Champion Build Guide by Gazebo Mimic and RPG Bot's Champion Handbook, which were very helpful in guiding me through the class. So without further ado, let's get into the character. Let's start approaching the Champion from a Dungeons & Dragons perspective. We know that paladins are this divine, righteous warriors who fight for a noble cause. They have some divine magic, they have the blessing of the god, and in general they are this zealous, religious fighters, kind of like more martial clerics. The Champion is very similar thematically. It has less emphasis on dealing damage and more emphasis on defense. In fact, a very obvious advantage of the Champion when compared to other martials is that its armor proficiency scales faster and reaches legendary, which is quite unique. However, when compared to a 5th edition Paladin, the Champion seems to be paying quite a heavy price for this increased survivability. They seem to be a lot less damage oriented than another martial class like the Barbarian. Furthermore, this Champion is more similar to an old school Paladin in the sense that it is bound by some very strict codes. This is also true from a certain point of view for the 5th edition Paladins. However, their oaths provide guidelines in a way, and they are very flexible because they have very different types of flavors. Whereas the Champion is a lot more polarized towards good and evil. If you are good, you have to be really good, and if you are evil, you have to be really evil. But there is no kind of oath of the ancient nature protector paladin, so kind of more neutral-ish paladins, or maybe even oath of vengeance paladins, which walk a bit of a gray area when it comes to moral decisions. This is because champions are bound by their tenets. The core rulebook only has the good tenets because it assumes you're going to play a good character. Evil paladins have it a bit harsher in theory. However, when I actually read this with more attention, never willingly committing a purely good act, such as giving something solely out of charity, though you can perform acts others might consider helpful, it must be done with the expectation that it ultimately furthers your own goals. I have to say that basically all the people I play with seem to follow these tenets, so maybe they are secretly bound by evil tenets and I wasn't aware of it. These are not, however, the only restriction our Champion has on what they can or cannot do. Their deity will have specific tenets which depend on what the god generally wants from their followers, and the Champion will also be bound by their cause, be it a good or an evil one. So this is an expansion and a heritage of the previous edition alignment restrictions for the Paladin. There are some people who lament the fact that alignment restrictions don't exist in 5th edition, but I am honestly not one of them. In fact, I find that the anathema system in general in Pathfinder 2nd edition is quite restrictive and I don't like it. I didn't like it for the Barbarian, but since the anathema was not a big deal, I didn't mention it. But the Paladin is just rules over rules over rules, which I guess that's part of the character, but I find that it detracts from your player's agency. If you wanted to play a character who follows a very strict rules code, you are always free to do that. You can do it in 5th edition. You just have to make up the code and follow it, and maybe agree with the dungeon master that as a part of your character development, you might meet a situation where you are forced to choose between your code and maybe your companions. Of course, this is not as satisfactory as this being actually enforced by the rules. However, if you have this rule system and this anathema system in place, what it means is that a player who wants to have a bit of creative freedom with the class, maybe they want to play a Batman-like character who has an honor code and follows some rules, but they are not the ones outlined here in these tenets. So this is the first instance of a feature in Pathfinder that I think I would enjoy less than the equivalent in 5th edition. And while I do believe that the Bard and the Barbarians were a better version of the 5th edition class, I cannot really say the same for the Champion, but this is of course very personal, and I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with that. The last consideration I want to make about Champion's anathemas is considering the iconic champion, which we can see here, who is Sela, and considering her role in the Pathfinder game Wrath of the Righteous, where she appears. I would like to point out that had she been a 2nd edition champion, she would not have been able to follow you around in more than half of your playthroughs, because her anathemas would not have allowed her to. Now, of course, Sela in that game is a bit of a particular character because she is a bit of an extreme example of paladin hypocrisy, because she's able to tolerate some pretty disgusting actions from the commanders. Even I, with my very flexible morality, would argue that maybe a good aligned champion should not be fine with you sending soldiers as living bait for Vescavors, or tolerating the existence of someone like Amelia, or being a literal demon. But the point of Sela in that game is that she's a companion who stands by your side. She is certainly a flawed individual, and she is struggling with her faith. She sees you as the leader of the crusade and somebody who can make the world a better place, perhaps even end the demonic threat, and she's willing to stand by your side and perhaps act as your conscience and try to temper your excesses, even in situations where others would have abandoned you, because she establishes a relationship with you and you are, at the end of the day, a friend for her, and she values friendship very highly. And so her attachment to her friendship in your regards clashes a bit with the tenets of her goddess, and she is able to choose whether she wants to stick by your side, even if she disagrees with your actions. She cannot argue with your results, or if she sticks with her beliefs and leaves. All this would not have been able to occur had she been a true paladin, because the second tenet of good is pretty clear. You must never allow immediate harm to one through inaction where you know you could reasonably prevent it. And I think Sela could have reasonably prevented a lot of the commander's excesses. With that, I'm going to shut up about anathemas and how much I dislike them. Please feel free to argue and do convince me that anathemas are actually excellent for the champion, because I feel like I would enjoy this class a lot more if I found a way to deal with this aspect of the character. Moving on, the last particular aspect of the champion class is the divine ally. They can choose at level 3 either a blade ally for enhanced martial prowess, and interestingly, this is how they get the critical specialization effect of their chosen weapon, which they otherwise would not get. All other martials, at least the ones in the core rulebook, get critical specializations effects automatically, and the paladin has to choose this ally, otherwise they won't get it. Which is, I think, is another interesting clue to indicate that the champion is not as much of a damage dealer as the other classes. It's not a big deal, but it is there. You can also choose a shield ally to enhance your shield, or you can choose a steed ally to gain a mount. So to conclude this overview, and before beginning with what I'm planning to do with the build, I would like to preface that I am not really a paladin guy. I don't play many paladins, and in fact, I only started enjoying the class in 5th edition. I also do not like playing defensive characters, because I like to be proactive rather than reactive on the battlefield. I also think that in Pathfinder, raising shields, while very powerful, to me personally would feel miserable. Spending an action to do nothing but, raise the shield is not very satisfactory to me. And I also think that the shield block feat, again, to me, would feel miserable. Having the shield breaking and having to replace it. And if you find a magical shield, then you are afraid of using it to shield block. So having said that, and having outlined my issues with the champion class, let's see what I plan to do with this character build. So my objective is to make a bad paladin. That is, an evil paladin, but also a bad one, in the sense that I'm trying to move away from what the game kind of expects me to play. So what I did in the previous builds was trying to understand what the character concept was about. Barbarian was about dealing damage, the Bard was about supporting, and then I built a damage dealing and a support build. Apparently, the champion is about tanking and supporting the allies. But since I don't like tanking, what I want to find out is, can you build the champion in an alternative role? How flexible is the Pathfinder system? Does it support it? Or is it a bad idea to try and pivot away from your core class strengths, as it would be in the 5th edition. In the 5th edition, if you try to make a damage-dealing bard, that's not completely impossible, but it might end up in a world of misery and disappointment for you. So, when I say bad paladin, I mean a paladin which is evil and which is not necessarily focusing that much on tanking, but has other goals for the character development. I also find that the evil tenets generally suit my roleplay better, although I do acknowledge that it might be hard to be a team player as an evil player. You also miss out on a lot of the strength of the champion by being evil. The class of the champion works if your reactions punish the enemy for attacking your allies, because you're very tanky, so the enemy doesn't want to attack you. But if they attack your ally, then you punish them with your reaction. If you are an evil champion, though, this doesn't work anymore, because the enemy doesn't want to attack you for 2 reasons. Because you are tanky and because your reactions punish him for doing so. So they can just take the safe options with tanks and ignore you, and instead focus on the rest of the party. So this is an issue we will have to solve throughout our character development. We will also have to solve the issue of losing lay on hands and not being able to self-heal. So I think this will be an interesting thought experiment to find out if by doing all these quote-unquote wrong things, which I don't believe are inherently wrong, they're just not obvious, if we end up with a character which is just useless and actually bad, or if Pathfinder 2nd edition allows us to still have a fun and serviceable character. Of course, while this is very interesting from a theory crafting point of view, I have to point out that I believe this is a bad approach to character development if you are planning to actually play the character. So if you find that the core elements of the class clash with what you want the character to do, the safest option is just to maybe consider changing the class to avoid getting stuck with mechanics you don't enjoy. But maybe there are some things about the champion class that appeal to you and you want to try and pivot the character in an interesting direction, and so let's see if that is possible. Starting at level 1, we can already try and solve one of the first issues of our bad paladin. Since we chose an evil cause, in particular the lawful evil tyrant cause, instead of getting the amazing lay on hands, we got touch of corruption, which is a bad damage dealing action instead of being a life-saving healing. Unless, of course, we have negative healing, in which case touch of corruption becomes just like lay on hands. So we want an ancestry which has that. We could go with a heritage and take the Dampier heritage. Instead, we're going to take a rare heritage, hoping that the Dungeon Master will have no objections, and choose the Skeleton. This is a fun ancestry. Hopefully, this also means the DM is fine with us taking rare option, and a nice thematic option for this kind of character is the returned background. We died, we came back miraculously. Yes, we did, only we did so as a skeleton. This gives us the Die Hard feat, which is one of the best feats you can get from the get-go of the character. And so I would understand why the DM might be a bit hesitant to give you this background. If he doesn't allow that, you can go with the standard backgrounds that give you assurance in athletics or good intimidation. But for this build, we're just going full on with the rare options. As far as the abilities go, the Paladin is a bit mad, multiple attribute dependent. But the Skeleton has a very good distribution of buffs, and the default settings with Strength, Dexterity and Charisma, Ancestry boosts, Constitution and Strength, background boost, and a Strength boost as the class boost allow us to start with an 18 in Strength, a 14 in Constitution, a 12 in Wisdom, and a 14 in Charisma, which is pretty nice for a Paladin. Unfortunately, we don't get many skills. One of them depends on our deity. As long as it allows a lawful evil alignment, it's fine. I think Irori would be a good option, and also an interesting one, because her tenets are to be humble, and we are a tyrant who is supposed to be in charge in general. I don't think these two tenets are mutually exclusive. We can be very careful in asserting our power and those around us, but the moment we decide that somebody is indeed our inferior, we feel compelled to train them to our exacting standards of excellence. So Irori would give us proficiency in athletics. And our only sad skill training, since we have charisma, I think taking intimidation is a pretty obvious and safe bet. As for our heritage, we already were pretty generous with rare feats, so let's not go with uncommon heritages. I think a fodder skeleton for 5 extra speed movement is a pretty good option, especially for a melee frontliner who wants to be up in the face of the enemies. We also get a pretty good ancestry feat, as in life so in death. This is basically adopted ancestry with a bonus to impersonating living creatures, which might come in handy. We will choose Dwarf because there are a lot of very good feats. We are Tyrant, as I showed before, and our class feat will be Iron Repercussions. This makes our Iron Command pretty good. It upgrades its damage to be persistent, which makes it more likely that the enemy will decide to not take the damage and will instead kneel. So let's just recap our reaction. Whenever an enemy within 15 feet damages us, we can use our Iron Command, and the enemy has to decide whether to kneel, so dropping prone is a free action. This means that to stand back up they will have to use another action, or to refuse to kneel, in which case they will take 1d6 mental damage, which is actually persistent mental damage. Furthermore, until the end of the next turn, all our strikes against that creature will deal 1 extra damage. This reaction gives me an idea. Trying to compete with the other marshals just on the damage, I think is going to fail horribly. But what marshals can also do in Pathfinder is a bit of crowd control, especially by grabbing and tripping. In particular, I think tripping is very strong because not only it applies the flat-footed condition to the target, but it also forces them to use an action to stand back up. So maybe we can make a two-handed tripping build with our Tyrant Skeleton Champion and still be effective without being a conventional tank. After all, a crowd controller is perhaps an appealing target, more so than a tank that doesn't maybe do as much. For our starting equipment, we may want to use a two-handed weapon, like a great axe, as we did for the barbarian. That would be the most damaging option. Or if we want to sprinkle in some athletic actions and some trips at this level, we can go with a reach weapon, like the Gizan. This has the trip trait, and it does deal just a little bit less damage than a Great Axe. If we buy this, of course, we renounce using a shield, because this is a two-handed weapon. As for our defenses, we cannot afford full plate armor, so I think that starting with chainmail is pretty reasonable, and as soon as we can afford it, we can move on to full plate. Moving on, at level 2, I think Desperate Prayer is a very good feat. It allows us to gain an extra focus point once per day, which is an extra use of our almost lay on hands, which we can use only on ourselves, which makes sense for a selfish character such as a tyrant. This becomes way better, of course, if we are in an all-undead party, which is a very interesting concept. For our free archetype, I think the Barbarian is a very appealing choice. This gives us the Rage action, which increases our damage a bit. It will allow us to get a lot of very powerful feats. And by raging, what we can do is to decrease our armor class, thus making us a more appealing target for the enemies. We want the enemies to hit us, because this way we divert attacks from the rest of the party, and we can use our reaction. If enemies see a Black Knight wearing a shield and looking pretty defensible, they might hesitate to attacking us. But what they will see is instead a Berserker raging and not having any shield. Our instinct will be the Giant Instinct. Right now, there is no reason to wield an oversized weapon. We would just be getting the clumsy without gaining any of the benefits. But eventually, we will be able to function as an actual Giant Instinct Barbarian, so gain the massive damage increase that the Giant Instinct gives us. The further reduction in armor class, again, synergizes with our build concept. At level 2, Barbarian also gives us Athletics, which we already have, so we can get another skill. I think Acrobatics is a reasonable proficiency to get. Vex and Confusticate me, I forgot the skill feat. You can take Titan Wrestler right now instead of at level 4 when I discuss it. And then at level 4 you can take something else, like an early Assurance in Athletics or Assurance in Acrobatics. At level 3 we get our first skill increase. Since we are focusing on Athletics, I will choose that for our battle maneuvers. We also get the general feat. I really like Incredible Initiative, and we choose our Divine Ally. We are not using a shield. We do not care for steeds. A lot of feats are required to support a steed and prevent it from dying horribly. So we will take the Blade Ally, which will eventually increase our damage a little bit, and it's the only way we can get critical specialization. At level 4 we get the feat that made me choose an evil champion, which is Aura of Despair. This aura, which is always active, gives a -1 circumstance penalty to saving throw against fear. And also any enemy that ends its turn within 15 feet of us cannot reduce the value of its frightened condition below 1. This means that Demoralize becomes a very good action. We are pretty decent at demoralizing with our charisma. Our allies might also be, and this aura empowers the rest of the party and us as well. For our archetype feat, we will get a Barbarian feat with Basic Fury, and I think, since we just got Aura of Despair, that Raging Intimidation is a pretty reasonable feat to get. We get Intimidating Glare, so we can use Intimidation more effectively. We can also take Titan Wrestler. If we want to undertake athletic actions at this level, we must use this feat so that we can trip creatures up to 2 sizes larger than us instead of only, or up to 3 sizes larger when we become legendary in athletics. At level 5 we get another skill increase. This time I think it's Intimidation's turn, and we also get our first ability boost. We want to increase our strength, increase our constitution, our wisdom, and our charisma, and these are the skills we will keep increasing as we level up. We get an ancestry feat, and a very good ancestry feat for us, since at this point we are for sure inside a heavy armor, is Unburdened Iron. This effectively gives us an extra 5 feet speed, because this reduces the penalty we would be taking from full plate. We also get our weapon expertise. At level 6 we get Attack of Opportunity. Now we might not be able to always use our Tyrant reaction, so this is an alternative for our reaction, and eventually we're going to gain 2 reaction with our classes, so one of them can be an Attack of Opportunity. This increases our damage. It's very good since we're using a reach weapon. For our free archetype feat, we get our Instinct ability. This is where we can finally use an oversized weapon, so we get a -1 to our armor class, but we increase our damage considerably. We also get a skill feat, and I think Intimidating Prowess is pretty good. This allows us to gain a circumstance bonus to Intimidation, which once we are master in Intimidation becomes, and we reach strength 20, becomes our +2. So it's pretty good. At level 7 we get another skill increase, and we can upgrade Intimidation to Master. And we do this because, as always, I'm a sucker for Intimidation feats. Again, as it was the case for the Bard, which liked performance, in this case we might have prioritized Athletics for the trip action. The general feat we will get is Toughness for the extra survivability. We also increase our armor proficiency, and we get weapon specialization. At level 8, I didn't see any class feats that really appealed to me. I also want to start leaning more heavily on my crowd control side of the build. And so I decided, instead of taking a champion feat, to take another archetype, and that archetype is the Mauler. Right now the Mauler is doing nothing because we already have proficiency and training in two-handed weapons, but this allows us to take with our archetype feat the knockdown feat. This is a 2-action activity which allows us to trip a creature with a strike. So we roll once for the strike, and then we can immediately attempt an athletics check to trip that creature without the multiple attack penalty. So this is a very efficient use of our action and makes us more into a crowd controller. This combined with reach makes us a very good crowd controller. We can try to knock down an enemy, and then the enemy has to stand up, wasting an action and triggering our opportunity attack. For the skill feat, the reason why we increased Intimidation was so that we could get Battle Cry. At level 9 we get another skill increase. I think at this point we must for sure increase Athletics to Master. We also get another Ancestry feat, and there is an excellent level 9 Ancestry feat for the Dwarf, which is Mountain Stoutness, double toughness for us who are a tank that is a tank because they lower their defenses to encourage the enemy to strike them instead of their allies. Having extra HP is very powerful, just like for the Barbarian. We get extra proficiency with our class abilities. We get increased proficiency in Fortitude saves and Reflex saves. And we also get our Divine Smite ability. Divine Smite deals persistent evil damage equal to our Charisma modifier to the creature that disobey our Iron command. The problem with that is that I don't see us facing many good enemies unless this is a very special campaign, and so this trait is really not doing anything for us, sadly, because evil damage will not affect neutral and evil creature, which is basically all the enemies we're going to fight. So unless our DM throws a bone at us, this ability is dead, and it's one of the reasons why playing evil champions is not as satisfactory as playing a good champion, because you've got basically dead class features. At level 10 we have extra ability boost. I will again boost the same abilities: Strength, Constitution, Wisdom and Charisma. We get a class feat. I will choose Radiant Blade Spirit, which sounds very good, but we can use it also if we are evil as well. This allows us to add some effects to our Blade ally. Previously we could use Fearsome, Returning or Shifting. Shifting might have been probably our default choice for flexibility to be able to deal different damage types or gain different effects. But right now we can get a free flaming slot on our weapon, Or if we want, we can have an axiomatic weapon. I don't think an unholy weapon would be particularly useful, but if we are fighting a lot of demons, maybe axiomatic is good enough. If not, flaming seems like a safe option. We get as our free archetype ability the Barbarian Resiliency. This allows us to gain additional hit points for all our Barbarian archetype feats. And we will also get more support for our intimidation feat with the terrified retreat skill feat. At level 11, we might start to try and catch up with acrobatics. It's not a skill we are going to try and use actively, but I think for a martial, being able to sometimes use acrobatics is kind of important, which is why I picked it with the barbarian as well. And as I said before, speed is kind of important for a martial, so we can take fleet for our general feat for the 5 extra movement speed. And we have 35 movement at this point, which is pretty good. At level 12, again, I wasn't able to find any particularly interesting class feats for the champion. And again, I think this is one of the reasons why I wasn't very excited about the champion, because unlike the barbarian, they don't seem to get many thematic or just cool class feats. And so my solution to that was to take barbarian feats instead. These do also give us extra hit points, but with advanced fury we can take our giant archetype feat, giant stature. I already built a build around this feat, and for us this is very impactful because gaining extra reach means we can use our battlefield control from further away, knock down creatures that are far away that then need to stand up and waste the movement moving towards us. It is easier for us to trigger our opportunities attacks, so it just synergizes very well with what we are trying to do here. For our free archetype feat, we take another amazing feat, and level 12 really becomes an incredibly powerful turning point for this build because we gain improved knockdown. This allows us, when we use knockdown, instead of making a strike and trip the creature, to automatically knock down the creature if our strike hits. We also get to apply the critical success effect of the trip, so we also deal damage. And this damage uses the weapon's damage die size instead of the regular die size for the critical trip, so a d10 for us. Very exciting ability. Now we are playing whack-a-mole with our enemies. At level 12, we might want to double down on our trips and use our third action instead of demoralizing, which is something which we can always do. Use that action to trip again. Now we would be suffering from a -10 multiple attack penalty, but if we are facing an enemy which is maybe lower level than us and has a low reflex saving throw, then we can use Assurance in Athletics to deny that -10 multiple attack penalty and automatically succeed at our second trip attempt. So this is the third option for control that we gain at level 12. It's certainly more circumstantial than the other two, but it is a powerful added arsenal to our build. I think level 12, it's the turning point maybe of this build. It's when this build starts feeling really, really good. At level 13, we reach mastery in acrobatics. We also get an ancestry feat, and I think a powerful ancestry feat, which we haven't taken thus far, is the skeletal resistance feat. This gives us resistance to cold, electricity, fire, piercing, and slashing damage. These are a lot of different types of damages. And this was at level 9. Right now it's level 13, so these resistances are actually 3. And they will become 4 at 17 level. So that seems very, very convenient. We gain master proficiency in our armor and in our weapons. Level 14 actually has a very exciting champion feat, which is Divine Reflexes. This is an extra opportunity attack, or rather an extra reaction which we can only use for our champion reaction. But now our opportunity attacks, which we are very good at doing, no longer compete with our champion reaction. We can do both. For our free archetype, I took more barbarian feats to benefit from the increased hit points. In this case, I took fast movement, which increases our speed by 10. This is a status bonus, so maybe there were allies casting long striders, in which case this wouldn't stack, but if there is no long strider, this is a very powerful effect. 10 extra feet of movement. combined with our incredible reach, we can really control the battlefield pretty well with this character. As for the skill feat, since we just gain master proficiency in acrobatics, we can take kip up, so that knockdowns, which is our speciality, do not affect us. They no longer make us waste an action, and standing up no longer causes us to trigger opportunity attacks. At level 15, we get our first legendary skill proficiency. I think intimidation is a must. We also automatically get scared to death. Here it is. I had to go back and retake Raging Intimidation to make this appear on Path Builder. We also get our ability boost. Again, we are buffing strength, we are buffing constitution, we are buffing wisdom up to 18, and we're buffing charisma up to 19. We also get a general feat, and since I don't feel like I have anything overly important right now, we can take Canny Acumen already. Again, this is something you would retrain at level 17, because right now this isn't doing anything. So if you are playing at level 15 and you're planning to spend a lot of time at level 15 at 16, take another general feat and then retrain into this. I'm just picking it now for convenience's sake. And we will increase our perception so that we get maybe to act a bit earlier in combat. We also get our greater weapon specialization. At level 16, we get a little bit of extra damage thanks to Instrument of Slaughter when we critically hit with our blade ally. While dealing extra damage because of our champion's reaction, the target will take persistent bleed damage equal to 2 of the weapon's damage dice. So this is a lot of damage, a lot of persistent damage, but the condition is a bit circumstantial. It's not even every time we crit. We have to crit an enemy that is affected by our champion reaction. This makes our Exalt Tyrant ability a bit better. I forgot to mention it. At level 11, there is really nothing to write home. This makes our Iron Command AoE and affects creatures within 15 feet of us, rather than just the creature that attacked us. However, the creature only takes minimum damage, which is like 3, and then it goes up to 6. So this means that, okay, creatures are going to take 3 or 6 damage, and they are never going to drop prone over this ridiculously low damage. But it does mean that they are most likely going to be still affected by the effect that gives them that makes them take extra damage from our attacks. So Instrument of Slaughter might trigger a bit more often because of that. For our free archetype, I will take more Barbarian feats. This one is a very nice one for our build, and it is Brutal Bully. When we successfully disarm, grapple, shove, or trip a foe while raging, we get to deal bludgeoning damage equal to our strength modifier, which gets added to our critical success to trip, which we automatically inflict thanks to improved knockdown. So improved knockdown becomes very powerful at this level. We can also get a skill feat. We could take Assurance in Acrobatics, or we could take something like some more fun acrobatics feat like Powerful Leap. I don't feel like skill feats are that impactful at this point, so take whatever you like. Level 17, we get our second legendary skill increase, and so this has to be Athletics, since we are tripping all day long. It's not that important because usually we're using improved knockdown, so we don't really need to make an athletics check. But if we want to use Assurance, or if we, for some reason, don't have the 2 actions to do the improved knockdown, then we might want to do an actual athletics roll. Our Ancestry feat at level 17 is a pretty cool one. Necromantic Hair allows us to cast Harm once per hour as a 6th level Divine Innate spell. We can use this to heal ourselves. So we do get a little bit of divine spell casting as a paladin. We also get Master Proficiency in our Class C and Divine Spells. This includes Harm, if for some reason we would want to use it offensively. And we also get Legendary Armor Proficiency at level 18, and this is actually another extremely cool champion feat, and I wish there were more of these. But we get Fiendish Form, so we become a fiend. Among the various benefits, dark vision and so on, which for some reason we didn't have despite us being a skeleton. We also gain a fly speed equal to our speed, which is pretty high. So we have perpetual flying speed, which is pretty cool. We also get a very cool ability from our Mauler dedication, which is Avalanche Strike. This is an AoE attack, a melee strike on everyone within reach, and our reach is pretty huge thanks to our giant proportions and our reach weapon. So if we are fighting lots of low-level enemies, we can do this 3-action activity and deliver AoE damage, kind of like a wizard. And then, since we are flying and we have very high acrobatics proficiency, I think we might as well take aerobatics mastery, so we are better at flying. Level 19, it's our last skill increase. Let's get legendary in acrobatics. We also get a general feat. I don't really know what to take, so I just took incredible investiture. Should we want to get more invested magic items at this level, we have high charisma, so we can take it. We are level 19, so we might have a lot of magical items, and this might come in handy. We also get the Hero Devotion spell. This focus spells allows us to basically not die when we would. The fun fact is that there are several effects like this in the game that I saw, especially in Ancestry feats that do something similar. But this is cool because this recharges not once per day, but once per refocus. So once per combat, we become really, really hard to kill. Of course, this doesn't really give us that much hit points. So probably if we are fighting a very powerful enemy, they would still be able to, smack us down again. But it's still a very potent increase to our survivability. We can couple this with Touch of Corruption in emergencies to just regain a bunch of health and increase our survivability by a lot. And finally, we get to level 20. We complete our ability boost, strength, constitution, charisma, up to 20, except for strength, which is 22. We have no reason to buff wisdom, because that would be wasted. Also, dexterity, we probably can use our armor to buff our reflex saving throw, so we don't need. We can get our intelligence up to 10 and get an extra skill proficiency. Let's take performance so that we can sing and dance merrily at the end of our career. We get our capstone ability, which is Sacred Defender. This gives us a bunch of damage resistance. It denies the natural 20 rule on us. The problem is that the resistance we gained only applies on good creatures, and once again, we're not expecting to fight many good creatures, so we are only here for the second half of the feat, which is still nice, but it feels a bit, gutted, and once again, it feels like we're getting punished for playing an alignment that the game really doesn't want us to play. For our free archetype, Brutal Finish, I think, is a nice capstone ability for the Mauler. It allows us to use 3 actions to deal damage. So our third action after a knockdown can be this Brutal Finish. This is a press, so we can use it only while we are being affected by a multiple attack penalty. And this is a strike, which is most likely going to miss, but even if it misses, we still get to deal 1 weapon damage die of the weapon we are using. Actually 2 weapon dice because we are level 20, which is bigger than level 18. So if we want to squeeze in a bit more damage at this level, we can do it with Brutal Finish. Again, you can take any other feat. This is not essential by any means. And finally, again, at level 20, we can get a legendary feat. We can take Cloud Jump. Why not? It's a fun feat. And that concludes our character build. I have to say that this character grew on me while I was making it, and I find it very interesting that we were able to build a martial character which specializes not quite on damage, but more on single target control, while also being able to tank and to divert the attacks of the enemies on himself because of how impressive he looks on the battlefield, because of his dimension and because of his screaming, intimidating nature. So I feel that, to me at least, and this is a very personal thing, and I'm sure there will be people that will find this very objectionable, but To me, a character that uses direction to knock down their enemies and rages a lot and becomes large and has a lot of reach and does attacks is more interesting than a character who uses direction to raise their shield and stays in the middle of the battlefield hoping to get hit and then does something reactively instead of proactively. So now the question becomes, by pursuing my own personal preferences, which were in this case in opposition with the base class template, what did we end up with? Is this a terrible build, damage-wise? Let's look at the damage projection and let's weep together, I guess. Alright, let us get the assumptions out of the way. We are fighting against enemies of our level with a high armor class. I am assuming standard item progression as far as runes and apex items are concerned. No reactions are taken into account for now. And we can see here the comparison with the double slicing fighter of the barbarian build. So a fighter who is dual wielding picks, and it's a crit build, which is allegedly one of the most damaging builds in the game. And as we can see, we are always below the fighter with our 2 strikes of the halberd, of the Gizarm, sorry. And this difference is we are doing between 75 down to almost 50%, 60-ish rather, damage of the fighter. Which is unsurprising. We knew from the beginning that we could not compete with this kind of damaging build with our character. However, more than half of the damage, up to 75% of the damage of the most damaging build in the game, is not unreasonable. We're not completely useless. Things, however, get worse from 8th level. If we want to use our knockdown action instead, we are striking only once with that action. And then, of course, our damage plummets down to less than half of the damage of the fighter. Of course, with the added utility of tripping the enemy and thus wasting direction and potentially triggering more opportunity attacks. But, I hear you say, what about the opportunity attacks? After all, the champion is a class built around their reaction, so surely we should take into account the damage our reaction enables. If we consider that we use our reaction to deal damage with our Iron Command, we must be fair and keep in mind that the fighter also starts with an opportunity attack. So if we take both opportunity attacks of the fighter and of the champion into consideration, then all the damage increases for both builds. Of course, this is a very optimistic projection because it assumes that our enemy is not going to drop on their knees. It assumes that the enemy is going to take the persistent mental damage from our reaction. So, in truth, this is the best scenario where we are pretty close to the fighter and we deal around 90% of the damage of the fighter. Of course, the fighter's opportunity attack always deals damage, whereas for the champion, it is the enemy who decides whether or not to take damage. I might assume that sometimes they might be willing to give up an action to avoid damage, especially if they are low on HP, and sometimes they might have loads of HP, so they will be willing to take that persistent damage rather than just wasting an action to stand up. I also feel the need to reiterate that our champion doesn't feel like a competitor for the fighter, not just for the lower damage, but because of the way it's built. With it, the ease with which it can trip enemies, it is a very good enabler for attack of opportunities from a build like the fighters, which needs enemies to do movement actions like standing up to deliver their attacks of opportunities. I would assume the double slicing fighter to have less reach and so less opportunities to attack moving enemies when compared to us. But if we trip enemies a lot, then the fighter also gets to do their opportunity attacks more, so we kind of synergize with each other. Another thing we should keep in mind is that it is true that we gain extra attack of opportunities at level 14 because of our divine reflexes, but I looked at the fighter and they also have a feat that gives them extra attack of opportunities, and they get it at level 10, so in reality if we were to take into consideration the second attack of opportunity, then past level 10, between level 10 and 14, this line would be higher. And then we would kind of catch up, but again, only in the very optimistic scenario where we can trigger both our Iron Command and an attack of opportunity in the same round. So, summing up this damage projection, we are, of course, outclassed by the fighter. If the fighter chooses to be a dedicated damage dealer, we are not in the same league. And so I think it is reasonable for us to try and lean more on the control side of the character as we try to do. But we have these two options. We can deal still reasonable damage with our 2 strikes, or we can choose to knock down for the control. If we are facing a lot of low-level enemies, maybe we should focus more on striking and dealing damage and not so much on knocking enemies down. And on the other hand, if we are in a boss encounter, then knocking them down and wasting their actions might be a lot more beneficial than dealing damage. Final thoughts. When I look at this skeleton champion build, I have to say that some of my skepticism towards the champion as a class have faded away. I think that we still managed to put out a satisfactory amount of damage, if not excellent. And if we compare ourselves to the barbarian, for example, we still have more survivability. Our armor class, despite all our efforts, is still higher than the barbarian, our first barbarian build. And in that build, we had taken the champion archetype to boost it. So it is reassuring to see that we cannot just steal class features by multiclassing. So the barbarian who multiclasses into a champion becomes more survivable, but doesn't become as survivable as the champion, and vice versa. The champion that multiclasses into the barbarian does deal more damage, and the +6 extra rage damage, which we were taking into account in the build, really helped us not to be completely ashamed when compared with the fighter as far as our damage was concerned. But we are still nowhere near the barbarian who could actually compete and in some scenarios outmatch the dual-wielding fighter. This seems like an interesting character and a fun one to play. I still feel like it's being held back by its anathemas, its tenets and causes. The idea of this returned skeleton who used to be maybe a great warrior or a great fighter, but was eventually defeated. His pride has taken a big hit, and while still being domineering and commanding, they also realized the power of teamwork is greater than the power of the individual. So this seems an interesting character concept and one that I would enjoy playing in a role-playing game, but I would have to fight against my causes and my anathemas to do so. At the end of this, the big question that remains is dealing 75% of the damage of a excellent dedicated damage dealing build enough to play a fulfilling character, or is this going to be a miserable experience at the tabletop? I know that Pathfinder's math is tight, so perhaps this drop in damage dealing is the difference between an enemy surviving and an enemy instead dying, and so dealing damage and potentially killing a party member or ourselves. So I'm asking the experienced players to give me some feedback and tell me whether this build is actually unplayable. It doesn't look like it's just a worse version of the fighter. It does different things. Especially the control aspect that the dual-wielding fighter doesn't have seems pretty useful. So with that question, I'm going to end the video. I thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.